When New York City removed a 7-foot bronze statue of Thomas Jefferson from its council chambers after nearly 200 years, the move made headlines. But this story runs much deeper than most realized. It touches on the contradictions of Jefferson himself and includes the life of Uriah Levy, the Navy's first Jewish commodore, who, as it turns out, commissioned the statue as a tribute to religious freedom. This was an incredible piece of art. The work was carried out by one of France's most celebrated sculptors, who cast Jefferson in bronze using a portrait borrowed from Lafayette. Some saw this statue's removal as a victory of so-called social justice, whereas others saw it as erasure, a symptom of what has come to be known as wokeness. So, was this the correction of a historical blind spot, or just another battle in America's modern culture war? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover the true story behind the statue New York banished. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Before we explore how one of America's most iconic founding fathers became the center of a modern-day controversy, let me introduce you to a game that lets you bring history's biggest figures into battle. Well, Jefferson isn't in the game just yet. Heroes of History features historical figures like Franklin, Lincoln, and Grant, with more to come in future updates. Available on mobile and browser, no downloads required. Heroes of History combines strategy, city building, and real-time battles. You unlock different eras and legendary heroes as you build your city. I started playing, and the first 4-star hero I unblocked was Abraham Lincoln. Yes, the Abraham Lincoln. That's right, the tall hat and all, but ready for combat. He has a cool support ability called President's Protection, which provides invincibility to all allies. You'll find everyone from Einstein to Cleopatra and even mythological gods. The best part? You never know who you're gonna get from the Hero Portal, the game's random summoning system that keeps you hooked whenever you open one. The coolest thing is that the game gets new monthly content, constant updates, new heroes, events, mini-games, and challenges that ensure you never get bored. So if you're into history, strategy, and well-made games, give it a try. You can download it for free by using our link in the description or by scanning the QR code on screen. Thanks to Heroes of History for supporting the channel, but now, back to our story. Let's go back to a time before Jefferson became a monument, before the controversy, when Thomas Jefferson was just a boy on the edge of the Virginia wilderness, reading books by candlelight. Born on April the 13th, 1743, at a plantation called Shadwell, Thomas Jefferson came into the world as the third of 10 children in a prominent Virginia family. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a respected surveyor and landowner with a towering presence and a keen intellect despite no formal education. His mother, Jane Randolph, came from one of the most influential families in the colony, descendant from British aristocracy. Together, they provided young Thomas with both land and legacy. As a child, Jefferson was quiet and observant. He spent long hours roaming the forest around Shadwell, cataloging plants and animals. He began his formal education around the age of 5, learning Latin, Greek, and French, languages that would serve him well in the years to come. He was fascinated by music, took up the violin, and developed a deep love of reading. By the time he was a teenager, he was said to own one of the most impressive private libraries in Virginia, though tragedy struck early in his life when his father died in 1757, leaving Jefferson a sizable inheritance of land and enslaved people. This was the reality of wealth in the colony of Virginia. Jefferson, like many of his generation, came of age in a world constructed upon the heinous reality of slavery. Though for context, we also need to acknowledge the fact that while slavery in America was brutal and deeply entrenched back then, it was not a crime unique to the New World. Other examples were unfortunately found throughout history in places like the Ottoman Empire, where vast numbers of Europeans and Africans were enslaved. Whereas in West Africa, kingdoms like Dahomey and Oyo built their economies in part by capturing and trading enslaved people. In East Asia, forms of hereditary servitude and debt bondage were practiced under dynasties stretching from India to China. Hence slavery, in one form or another, has marred nearly every continent throughout human history. With that in mind, Jefferson's own life would go on to shape the very foundation of a nation, After studying law at the College of William and Mary, he entered politics, just as the American colonies began to stir with revolutionary ambition. Then, in 1776, at only 33 years old, he penned the Declaration of Independence, a document that gave voice to the emerging idea of human liberty, even as he remained a man who personally benefited from slavery. Throughout his career, he served as governor of Virginia, ambassador to France, secretary of state, vice president, and eventually became the third president of the U.S. His presidency saw the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the nation, and the Lewis and Clark expedition, which mapped it out. He founded the University of Virginia, designed its curriculum, and believed deeply in education as the backbone of a functioning democracy. But Jefferson's final years were marked by personal and financial strain. His debts mounted and his health declined. By the summer of 1826, he was bedridden at Monticello, suffering from a range of ailments, including kidney disease and severe diarrhea, likely linked to dehydration and infections common in the era. His daughter Martha tended to him in his final days. On July the 3rd, 1826, Jefferson fell into a coma. By the early morning of the next day, July the 4th, he briefly awoke and, according to those at his bedside, asked, "Is it the 4th?" When told it was, he slipped back into unconsciousness and died just 4 hours later at the age of 83. In a moment of eerie historical symmetry, his old friend and one-time rival, John Adams, died that very same day, the 50th anniversary of independence. Jefferson was laid to rest on the grounds of Monticello in a family cemetery, shaded by old trees. He had personally designed his gravestone and chose to inscribe it not with the presidential title, but with the 3 accomplishments he most valued: author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. There was no grand state funeral, just a quiet burial on a Virginia hillside where his legacy would take root, not just in textbooks or political speeches, but eventually in the form of statues. Let's move forward to 1826. The U.S. was expanding westward, and its cities were swelling with industry, trade, and ambition. The memory of the Revolution was still fresh, but the realities of running a republic were setting in. Steam power was changing transportation, factories were changing labor, and the idea of what it meant to be American was beginning to shift. Slowly, unevenly, and often contentiously. Jefferson's death marked more than just the passing of a founding father. For many Americans of the time, he represented an intellectual backbone of independence, a man who had defined the country's ideals and language that still stirred patriotism. His legacy was largely celebrated, especially in the South and among educated elites. While the country certainly wrestled with political divides, the deeper question of Jefferson's personal contradictions, such as his role as a slave owner, would not come to dominate public discourse until much later. In this post-Jefferson America, one man saw in Jefferson not just a statesman to admire, but a personal champion of principles that had long been denied to him. Uriah Phillips Levy was born in Philadelphia in 1792, just as the U.S. was beginning to find its footing. His family were Sephardic Jews, descended from ancestors who had fled persecution in Europe. Like many children of that first American-born generation, he grew up hearing stories of liberty, revolution, and self-determination, but he also experienced firsthand the limits of those promises. From an early age, Levy was drawn to the sea. He left home at 10 and was working on ships by the time he was a teenager. When the War of 1812 broke out, he joined the U.S. Navy, eager to serve the young republic. His naval career, however, was as combative on land as it was at sea. Over the years, he was court-martialed multiple times, often for dueling or defending himself against slander and anti-Semitic insults. These weren't minor squabbles. He risked his career again and again, refusing to accept disrespect based on his religion. Still, he persevered. He rose through the ranks and eventually became a commodore, the highest rank in the Navy at the time. Along the way, he built a fortune in real estate, especially in New York, which gave him the freedom to pursue causes that mattered to him. One of those causes was naval reform. Levy became a vocal opponent of flogging, the Navy's preferred method of punishment back then. He called it inhumane and outdated, and though it made him unpopular among some of his peers, he lobbied for its abolition, successfully, as in 1850, Congress officially banned the practice, a quiet but lasting victory. But there was one figure who had inspired Levy from the very beginning, Thomas Jefferson. To Levy, Jefferson was the embodiment of the American promise, a man who believed in individual liberty, religious freedom, and who had written those beliefs into the framework of the nation. Levy credited Jefferson with making it possible for someone like him, a Jew in a Christian-majority country, to serve, to succeed, and to belong. He once wrote, quote, "I consider Thomas Jefferson to be one of the greatest men in history. He did much to mold our republic in a form in which a man's religion does not make him ineligible for political or government life." To honor that legacy, Levy made a decision. He would commission a statue of Jefferson, not as a politician or president, but as the author of ideas that still shaped the republic. This was to be a grand monument. He reached across the Atlantic to French sculptor David Decay, a respected artist and a contemporary of Jefferson's time in Paris. The result would be one of the first full-length monumental sculptures of Jefferson ever made. But Levy's admiration didn't end there. As fate would have it, the home where Jefferson had lived and died was now falling into ruin, and Levy would also take it upon himself to save it. In the years following Jefferson's death, Americans nationwide began finding special ways to preserve his legacy. The founding generation was fading, and the young republic was hungry for monuments. Towns named schools after him. His writings were reprinted, and his Monticello home, long neglected, became the subject of national concern. Uriah Levy wasn't alone in honoring Jefferson, but his gestures were among the most ambitious. As Levy began restoring Monticello, he simultaneously undertook another effort to enshrine Jefferson's image. Literally, he commissioned not one, but two full-length bronze statues of the former president. He turned to a celebrated French sculptor known for capturing the spirit of great thinkers and revolutionaries. According to most scholars, his work reflected the heroic idealism of the age, precise, expressive, and distinctly romantic. Levy and Decay met in France sometime around 1832. Levy was in Europe on naval business, but had also sought out the aging Lafayette, a longtime friend of Jefferson. Lafayette owned a portrait of Thomas Jefferson by Thomas Solely and lent the item to Levy to aid the sculptor. Using this likeness, David Decay created a powerful full-body rendering of Jefferson, standing tall, with the Declaration of Independence resting under his hand. The statue was cast in bronze in France, an expensive and logistically complex process in the 1830s, though when it was complete, Levy arranged for two casts. One was shipped across the Atlantic to Washington, D.C., where he donated it to the United States government in 1834, where it became the first privately funded statue ever placed in the Capitol Rotunda, a space reserved for the most revered figures in American history. The second statue was gifted to the people of New York. It would eventually find its home in City Hall, where it stood for nearly 2 centuries. Reception to these statues was respectful, though perhaps not as sensational as Levy had hoped. The Washington statue was seen as a fitting tribute, a quiet but dignified addition to the Capitol. The New York statue, placed in the very seat of city governance, became a symbol of the Enlightenment ideals that Jefferson had championed: law, liberty, and the secular order of a democratic state. Meanwhile, Jefferson's memory continued to grow in stature. Nearly a century later, in 1943, on the 200th anniversary of his birth, the Jefferson Memorial was completed in Washington, D.C. The dome, the columns, and the grand statue inside were all designed to place Jefferson on the same monumental scale as Washington and Lincoln. Even so, for decades before this neoclassical temple rose, the 2 bronze statues Levy commissioned had already been doing their quiet work, standing still while the world moved around them. Uriah Levy would die in 1862, during the height of the Civil War. He passed away in New York and was buried in Brooklyn's Cypress Hills Cemetery, in the section reserved for the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, an enduring connection to his faith. In his will, he left Monticello to the U.S. government, along with a fund to create a naval orphanage. The government declined, and after years of legal disputes, his nephew, Jefferson Monroe Levy, took over stewardship of the estate. David d'Angers died in 1856 in Paris after a prolific career that left his mark across Europe, and perhaps appropriately, his grave rests not far away from the intellectual giants whose faces he once carved. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the statues they created and commissioned continued to stand in their appointed places, one in the Capitol, the other in New York City Hall. The world changed around them, though. Civil wars, world wars, the rise of modern democracy, and the reshaping of public memory. Through it all, these statues remained. One stayed largely untouched, regarded as a symbol of national identity. However, the other, in New York, would one day find itself caught in the crosscurrents of a new kind of debate. A debate perhaps not about who Jefferson was, but about how he should be remembered. In the early 21st century, America found itself in a period of profound cultural friction. Protest, partisanship, and shifting national narratives collided in the public square. According to most accounts, American society reached the point of no return upon the George Floyd incident in 2020, which sparked a wave of demonstrations and riots across the country, calling attention not only to policing, but to the very symbols of America's past. Suddenly, statues were no longer just statues. They were litmus tests, objects of pride for some and targets of outrage for others. Across the U.S., monuments to Confederate generals were pulled down by crowds or quietly removed by officials. Cities like Richmond, Baltimore, and New Orleans cleared statues that had stood for generations. But the debate didn't stop with the Confederacy. It soon widened to include figures once considered untouchable: Christopher Columbus, Teddy Roosevelt, and eventually Thomas Jefferson. In October of 2021, New York's City Public Design Commission voted unanimously to remove Jefferson's statue from the city council chambers. The decision came after years of pressure from some council members who argued that Jefferson's history as a slave owner made his presence in the chamber intolerable. Supporters of the removal called it a long overdue correction. To them, the statue was a symbol of hypocrisy, honoring liberty on one hand, while ignoring the bondage that made Jefferson's wealth and lifestyle possible. They pointed to his ownership of hundreds of people and the slave labor that built Monticello as proof that his image had no place in the heart of a government meant to serve all citizens. But critics, especially on the right, saw something else: the creeping influence of cancel culture and ideological purification. They argued that removing Jefferson from City Hall wasn't a gesture of progress, but a sign of cultural amnesia. They noted that Jefferson wasn't being honored for owning slaves. Rather, he was being honored for writing the words that would eventually lead them to freedom. To them, the removal wasn't just about one statue. It was part of a broader movement to revise history, but through a modern lens, where complexity is flattened and context is discarded. Some saw this as a very dangerous trend that could actually erase the very foundation of the republic they were doing this in the name of. And this wasn't just happening in America. Across the world, monuments were falling. In the UK, a statue of a 17th century slave trader, Edward Colston, was toppled and dumped in the harbor. In South Africa, statues of colonial figures were removed under the rallying cry of decolonization. And it should also be noted that the toppling of statues is not something unique to our time. In Eastern Europe, monuments to communist leaders were taken down after the Cold War. In Germany, Nazi imagery was taken down after the Second World War. And I'm sure that all of you remember those images in post-Saddam Iraq, where his towering likeness was torn apart by crowds just days after Baghdad fell. In other words, throughout history, regimes change, and with them, so do these symbols of power. But what made the Jefferson case so unique was that, on the surface at least, this was not exactly about regime change. It was a democracy, struggling openly with its own legacy. Some voices tried to bridge the divide. They acknowledged Jefferson's flaws, acknowledged the injustice of slavery, while arguing that erasing him ignored his most radical and enduring idea, that all men are created equal. That idea, they claimed, was not an endorsement of Jefferson's life, but a challenge he left behind, a standard future generations could use to measure not only him, but themselves. This is precisely the reason Uriah Levy commissioned those statues. He had once seen Jefferson as a man who made room in the Republic for people like him. For decades, that statue in New York stood as proof that freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and representative government weren't just slogans. They were aspirations, cast in bronze. But by 2021, the aspiration no longer outweighed the perceived contradiction. Well, at least not in New York. The statue wasn't destroyed. It wasn't defaced or dragged through the streets. It was carefully removed, crated, transported, and relocated to the New York Historical Society, where it now stands under different lights and different interpretations. In that decision, some saw justice, whereas others saw surrender. And through it all, the statue remains unchanged in form but transformed in meaning, a monument not just to Jefferson, but to the ongoing debate over how a country remembers itself. The statue now stands in a museum far from the chamber where it once watched over New York City lawmakers. Though its removal did not settle the debate, it simply gave it a new backdrop. And the larger questions, they still remain. What defines a legacy? Who decides, and are we allowed to have heroes? Covering stories like this is always challenging, not because the facts are hard to find, but because most of them come through a lens of bias, one way or another. That's why the discussions like these often benefit from many voices. If you think something was missed, misrepresented, or deserves more attention, please share your thoughts in the comments section below. Otherwise, I thank you all for watching, and until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.